as I'm still kind of working through with this, I do it as self/story, or even self-story, self-story.
I'm glad I've had some influence here.
Tremendous. Tremendous. So
that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Self/story is beautiful. I mean, we'll talk about it, of course, more in much more expanded tantric form, but receive.
And I would like to actually suggest that these are all kind of almost like their own lineage or their own vein, their own enlightenment tradition within spirituality, within religion. Spirit, suchness, self-story.
Well, you know what I would love to do, Brother B? Let's maybe try and talk about each one and what that might mean. Perhaps we might want to add one in a second. But before we do that, with your permission, I'd like to go back to something you said before, because I know that once we get into spirit, suchness, and self-story, we're going to be, off to see the wizard, the wonderful wizard of evolutionary spirituality. But I want to just step back for a second, because I think you said something very, very important in the beginning, which is that, a genuine tantric tradition, a genuine expand tradition. And I think Rabbi Cook represents that in the Hebrew tradition, as does Izbuka, as does Mordechai Leiner of Izbuka. I wrote my doctorate for Professor Moshe Edel on Izbuka at Oxford, but I did it really just as an excuse to force myself to sit down and write 1,000 pages about him. I mean, he's so gorgeous, he's so beautiful, and he really is the lineage I try to bring to the integral world, who expresses what, in my reading of him, I call the unique self. But these are all tantric masters in the Hebrew tradition. But I want to focus just for a second on what you said earlier, which is that to create a trans path, or a trans-path fast, what one needs to do is really, really to receive very, very deeply, the past. One needs to, in deep mode of what one might call reverential receiving and submission. And before one moves to higher levels or more expanded levels or more self levels, there's a place of reverential receiving, right, and profound surrender and submission. And that's precisely what the word Kabbalah means. And Kabbalah means to receive, but it means more than just receiving in a kind of technical sense. It's a reverential receiving. It's a complete opening of self, right, to receive, the gorgeous wisdom of the generations. And in this sense, when people like Kohlberg use the term, and after him Gilligan, the student, uses the term, pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, and they talk about conventional spirituality, the word always jarred me, because conventional kind of implies to us kind of boring. Conventional implies kind of staid and set. Conventional implies, non-creative, inadequate. And that's really not what the conventional is. The conventional level of spirituality, right, is the greatest and most subtle and gorgeous hearts and minds, of all of humanity across the planet, who approached reality and gave us and willed to us and inherited to us a kind of deep and profound wisdom about how to live. So whether we're talking about sexuality, for example, and we talk about going post-conventional, right, we got to be really careful with that. And it's something I'm thinking about a lot the last year and a half, because there's enormous wisdom in the conventional. And so I think what you're really saying is that, to borrow Robert Keegan's phrase, we need to transcend and include, right? The phrase that Ken made famous, we need to transcend and include. And what Keegan, says in his books so correctly, coming, from Hegel and really coming from all levels of consciousness thinkers, is we really need to, reverentially receive, the Kabbalists, reverentially receive. The Zen student, sits for many years in reverential receiving before any moment of creativity. And I want to just kind of bow to that. To bow to the traditions and to bow to the masters, and to bow to the places where they asked us to constrict and to be limited and defined, and at the same time, to understand that this is our time and this is our moment. This is where our, unique self-story, as we'll unpack later, emerges, and that we need to expand, but we're expanding from within. We're expanding from a place of deep and profound, submission, surrender, Kabbalah, reverential receiving to the traditions. Does that resonate with you, brother?
That resonates very deeply with me. I'm actually my own little font of bubbling joy that you took that backward step for a moment. That I would actually like to, if you would be able to receive that, to stay for a bit in this stream.
Yes.
My sense is that we'll have so much time to continue, our little romantic dialogues here, that we can maybe afford to sit in the sweetness of this beginning embrace for a bit.
Amen. Amen. Let it be so.
And I would add to that, and this is some articulation that was also brought forward from C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
Um,
We love those Oxford Dons.
yes.
Married to a girl.
Yes, we do. And he said that he was giving a lecture at a certain time talking about God, and a man in the audience stood up and said, bogus, I call bogus on this. This is all kind of worthless. All these ideas you have about God, that's not God. And this man said, I've met God, I know God. And interestingly, C.S. Lewis, then as he's commenting on this, says, I'm sure this man did meet God. I don't know how he's making these determinations, but for the point of our story, he says, I'm sure that this man did meet God. And he likened it, he said, it's like if the man were actually out at the ocean, if he'd actually been to the ocean and stood there with the sound and the surf and the waves and the wetness of the ocean, and then came back and somebody showed him a map of the ocean, and he were to say, that's a map, that's not actually the ocean, I've been there. And he said, on the one hand, we could actually say he was turning from something more real to something less real. But then he does this kind of really beautiful turn, and he says, however, one of the things we have to remember about that map, right, is that the map is the condensation. The map is the integration of hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people who've been to the ocean, just as you've been to the ocean, and have woven those experiences together and offered them to you today as this map. And in that way, the map is precious. The map is, precious beyond compare. And he said, if you just want to stand on the shore, you don't really need the map. But if you want to have a life out at sea, the map is very necessary. The map is of supreme importance if you want to have a life out at sea. On the other hand, if you're never going to have a life out at sea, the map actually doesn't have that much importance. So we need that direct experiencing, and we need some teaching and some mapping from tradition. And we kind of have to reverentially receive both the direct experience and the kind of traditional mapping.
No, that's completely beautiful and completely important. And I'm actually delighted. There's a beautiful Hebrew word sha'ashua, which means delight, and actually divine delight. And divine delight as the motive force for the creation of the world. And we're afraid of delight today. We're afraid of ecstasy. And I just want to just be delighted. I want to just to really ground our sacred conversation in delight and ecstasy. And I'm really delighted that we're beginning from this place. It's something that I've wrestled with over the last over the last years. There's a beautiful teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the holy Baal Shem Tov, Mamer Still Holy, right, the master of the good name, who reads the text of the prayer, the God in second person prayer, where it says, source of all blessings are you, God, and God of my fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. And we've added in appropriately the feminine, God of Sarah, and God of Rebecca, God of Rachel, God of Leah. So the Baal Shem Tov, he says, what's the difference between my God and the God of my fathers? And he says that if I don't have this dual relationship to the divine, God in second person, if I don't have this dual sense of what's happening within my own divinity, my own incarnate divine, God in first person, right? If I don't have two relationships, right, to the canonical text and to the rituals, right, God incarnate in third person,